been lovely to be here. It's been an eye-opener to me. I feel like I've entered into a new tribe of which I am completely unfamiliar. But I do know now that I've got an increased chance of dying a toxic death, so thank you all for that, nevertheless.
Not prematurely.
No, but yes, if not prematurely. What I'll go on and convey to you is how irrational and difficult human beings are. Everybody in the top box is a psychologist. Everybody in the bottom box, Chris and Steve, are engineers. So they're at Cenex. So we came together. We worked together predominantly on the UK, TSB as it was then, the Innovate UK, ultra-low carbon vehicle demonstrator trial. And it was really a lovely thing, actually, to bring together the human data with the hard, objective data of the cars themselves. They always referred to us as providing soft data. So brace yourself for soft data. That gets the pulse racing, doesn't it? So what would make somebody make the transition from the award-winning car on the left to the award-winning car on the right? So on the left being the ICE Ford Fiesta last year, and on the right being the BMW i3. It's a difficult transition to make. It's something that they call a discontinuous change or a discontinuous innovation, because it's not something that involves a natural evolution from one thing to another. You're asking quite a lot of people, actually, to change from one to the other. OLEV calls this once-in-a-lifetime technology change. And the thing is, with vehicles, they've got all these wonderful objective attributes that some of us might be interested in. I'm sure from an engineering perspective you're interested in too. Some of the discourse around electric vehicles focuses on this, the range, the speed, typically. But although, say, Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, a car is never just a car. A car has got a lot of subjective meanings too. We heard that from some of the talks yesterday as well. And particularly Graham was mentioning how everything is situated in a wider context of meaning. So you can see what the manufacturers are trying to do here in terms of robustness or sophistication. The problem is, with the electric vehicle, they've got lots of these subjective meanings to try and overcome or to adapt to or to incorporate in some way. Whatever we're looking at, whether it's the objective evaluation or the subjective evaluation, is cognitively mediated by that individual. It's based on their own preconceptions. We find that even before people get into the vehicle, they've more or less decided how they're going to use it. Very little has been done on that pre-stage until the stuff that we've done now, actually. And their habituated behavior. A lot of yesterday was implicitly talking about change. One of the problems is people do things not for necessarily reasons that are conscious to themselves or that they hold an explicit attitude that you might be able to change through an educational program. They do things because that's what they do. And that operates on a very unconscious level. It's cued by the context. It becomes repetitive and automatic. So good luck to us trying to change those kind of things. We've also got the pioneer individual, if you like, that's in a social context where they've got other people who don't have that innovative technology, and they will hold a lot of ideas, as Peter was talking about in the previous EV talk, about what an electric vehicle is. So we've typically found that you've got some who are very, very difficult to change. They're very much based on an affective or emotional response. They will happily tell you they know nothing about electric vehicles, and then they will equally happily tell you everything that's wrong about them. That's an interesting thing to hold in your head at the same time. I know nothing, and I'm an expert. We've got another bit in the middle, which is people kind of sitting in judgment. So they're far more cognitively engaged. They're going to be the people, maybe the second tranche of people that Peter asked to put up their hands, people who might be considering getting an electric vehicle. So they're sitting in judgment, what is the actual landscape like and what are these things capable of doing? So for our participants, we had 19 different car manufacturers. After we finished doing the stuff with BMW, or we were on the road with that, then when Andrew Everett, when he was head of the TSB stuff into transport, he heard our presentation and wanted that stuff rolled out across the whole of the UK, and it was organised in 8 different consortium groups. So Chris and Steve, the engineers, had the joy of looking at over 250,000 trips, 1.5 million miles travelled, and all of these different charging events. Our report is available on the OLEV site and the Innovate UK site there. So part of the challenge of this transition, it's implicit in what I'm saying, is you're going from something that's known and useful and completely slots into everyday life and fits your needs to something that's unknown. Why would you do it? Our participants are quite typical for a group like this. So they're quite affluent, 3 to 1 male to female. We have 200 of them plus who are private individuals. So they have a motivation to engage in this. And what you've got on a motivation continuum is those who identify with it in some way. It's important to them to be part of this vanguard, this initial bunch. But then we have a corporate group as well. Now, some of those were from city councils that had a green agenda. They're quite interesting because they behave in pretty much the same way in terms of their adaptation because they identify with the company's green agenda. So it doesn't have to be something the individual holds personally. You can get people to adapt well if you can get them to identify with something a little bit more broad. We also had pool car drivers, though, and they're a different kettle of fish entirely. So they were people who were told to drive these vehicles. They tended to have a little bit of a say in that. Say the affluence is quite important. All of the rest of the demographics are as you'd expect. It was a sustained usage, so it was over a period of months, which is important because it enables us to give a sort of a better overall picture. So what are those meanings of the electric vehicle? It seems to have changed a lot since 2008 when we started this, actually. You could sort of get a little bit of a sense of it in the rooms. So my first job ever was as a milkman, and the number of times I've heard this about milk floats and golf carts. But in that actual trial, you know, I'd have felt very lucky if I'd got to deliver milk in one of these things, I can tell you. I was at one great consortium meeting where one group said, oh, we've just broken the EV record, and another group of manufacturers went, so have we. And then another group had as well, so they were all really proud with the speed of the vehicles. The participants themselves were really impressed with it too. So in terms of the handling, the performance, and the acceleration once it was moving, it really cheated their expectations. There was a wide range of power of the vehicles within this trial. So that satisfaction tended to alter with the power as well. But on the other hand, some people who are living very much in the inner city who had maybe less powerful less powerful vehicles, they weren't too dissatisfied with it either. Overall, so what I have here is the private drivers on the left, the fleet drivers as I call them on the right. We have a 1 to 5 scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree. I've put the percentage of agreement, including number 4s, number 5s at the top. This is the mean and standard deviation. So you can see that it's not getting much better than that, really, for this particular group. And it was fun to drive, so that was one of the things that they were concerned about, because often some of the stereotypes that hang over from the old generation of electric vehicles is that they aren't fun to drive. And in fact, they are fun to drive. Oh, here we go, engineers, and there's a graph, of engineering graph. So we've got state of charge on the left and trip distance on the right there. And essentially what this is showing is that unless a driver is getting to a long distance, they're stamping on the pedal. They're taking full advantage of that speed. So in Rogers's innovation, diffusion of innovation model, what he talks about is 2 key things in order of accepting an innovation, and that's relative advantage and compatibility. So people do want these things to slot into their normal everyday lives, to be compatible with it. And as soon as it is, you just drive it like a normal car. So on the one hand, those negative stereotypes are outdated, I think. And I go into the interview data in a lot more detail in some of the papers that we've done, but for an overview, I think questionnaire data is a little bit better. Would I recommend an electric vehicle to others? It doesn't matter what group you're in, they are going to do that. In fact, these people act as ambassadors. It was interesting hearing what Peter had to say, actually, about the network forming. So they're going out, but we have a particular bunch here. And that bunch that we have is in Rogers's adoption curve. What we have really is the early adopters. And the holy grail for somebody with a new product or innovation is getting across that chasm to the early majority. Hence the lack of number of people that put their hands up in terms of a relatively small number when they're considering having an electric car. Those people, though, they contribute to the creation of a new meaning. The challenge is, can you actually get your shoulder behind trying to create that meaning yourself, or do you just have to wait for it to emerge? So that's fine. In terms of the novel features, so you're looking at this relative advantage, there are a number of things that were concerning for the participant drivers before they got in the car. So we're saying, well, beforehand, what I should have said earlier on too, is that we designed questionnaires and interviews, and we had all of the drivers complete those before they got in the car, a number of them on first contact, and then we interviewed them again a week later, so you get a sense of that immediate adaptation, and then 3 months later, so we have something over time. They think it's going to be easy. Is it going to be as easy as your normal car? It's not too bad. We've got a lot of agreement, but you can see it's moderated a bit. Some of the key things that are difficult or new are the regenerative braking, so the fact that you don't actually need to put your foot on a purpose brake, so you can slow down by taking your foot off and kinetic energy comes back. So how about that? You think that that might be a bit difficult. They adapt to that immediately. They preferentially use it on their first trip. It's something that's simple. There are lots of new displays as well. They find those clear, visually arresting, and they're quite positive about them. But when we say to them, so this is quite interesting actually, because you could eke out a greater range if you were to drive the car in an efficient manner, and if you were to use the regenerative braking effectively. So we say to them, so how much energy did you regenerate? How many more miles have you got? They have no idea. And this is something that manufacturers have to have a look at, actually, if they really want people to drive the things better, more efficiently, and if they do want them to use the range effectively. So learning to use my EV, let's just remind ourselves, they thought it would be easy. It was even easier. They thought it would be quite easy to use in terms of their normal car, far easier. In terms of their initial adaptation, as soon as they get into the vehicle, it's a new thing, and as I say, they're part of a group. It's not a pure group of participants. These people aren't simply using a car. They're using a car and feeding back that information to us and to the manufacturer as well. And that forms all part of the phenomenology of their sort of experience, really. Something that they liked happily. But they all learn to drive it very competently, very quickly, to use the regenerative braking, and to interpret the displays, and we call that primary adaptation. If you can't drive an electric vehicle, you can't drive. It's just such a simple thing to get into. Something that's come up over the last couple of days too, in terms of the primary limitations. There we go, there's another bit of Norwegian artwork. Munch's scream is range. The interesting thing about our participants here is that they think that it's going to be a problem for everyone else, but for me it'll be fine. So I think what they're saying is, I think in terms of the wider kind of marketing of this vehicle, it's going to be a problem. But for me, it'll be okay. It makes sense. They've had to make a decision to engage in this trial, and most of them are paying money to do so. They do expect that having this electric vehicle will decrease the number of exceptional journeys they have, and will increase the cognitive load. That is, that they'll engage in more planning before taking their car out. Actually, this doesn't happen. They don't engage in more planning. And they don't engage in more planning because they set the limitations of range before they've even become introduced to the car. There's something, social cognitive theories, that talks about our anticipations of doing things and our reflections upon those. What they've done is they've considered to themselves, what is an electric vehicle? What is it capable of? What does my lifestyle require? What strategies am I going to put in place in order that this vehicle is compatible with that lifestyle? And then they tend not to deviate too much from it. So that shows that initial information is very important, but also potentially first contact is very important too, if you can change that. Another fascinating thing that undermines, in fact, how far they think the car will go are the authoritative voices themselves. So the manufacturers, for instance, would tell them on first contact, well, the car should do this, but don't count on it going more than 2/3 of that. Wait, who designed this? You, who's giving me this thing, and you've already set a buffer in your own head. What am I going to do as a sensible thing? I'll set a more conservative buffer too. On one of the other training days, the person who was in charge of it said, I did try and exhaust the range, but mind you, I did take a pickup truck with me. This isn't designed to instill confidence in anybody. Fleet managers, this makes complete sense. Fleet managers want the car to be completely topped up so that when the drivers come back, they are confident that they can take it out. But it has a counterintuitive aspect to it too. It's like if you imagine a mother saying to their child all the time, don't skin your knees, don't skin your knees, don't skin your knees. Why aren't you climbing trees? You keep telling me not to skin my knees. I'm not going to take a risk-like behavior. And it turns out that there is an advantage to getting down to the lower states of charge in terms of your adaptation. Really interesting review of the BMW i3, a 5-star review. That says the car is excellent. Almost the whole review by the media, by the person who wrote it, was about his own fear of running out of range. So the review essentially was about him rather than the technical object. So we asked ahead of time what drivers would consider to be an adequate and an ideal range. So you can see 75 miles and 100 miles for the fleet drivers in terms of adequate. We asked them again at 3 months. You see that it goes out a little bit for the adequate and it contracts a little bit for the ideal. We also asked them how far they can confidently go. For the private drivers, they say 67, and for the fleet drivers, they say 76. The average expected range as a maximum given by the manufacturer was 100 miles. So you see you're looking at about 2/3 to 3/4 of that. Actually, the engineering data show that when they're at their most efficient, they tend to drive around 67 miles. So that's quite interesting that they have an intuitive feel of what objectively actually is happening. So you want it to go 210 miles. How far are you driving it? Trip average mileage is around 5 miles. This is compared to a national travel survey of around 7 miles. That's for internal combustion engine cars. Daily mileage is around 20. Weekly mileage, on average, for the private drivers is about 100. So about 50% of what they're requiring, what they're asking. So their demands and their expectation way exceeds, as I'm sure most of us in this room would understand by now, their actual usage. Interestingly, too, we find over time that people increase the distance between charges, but nothing much happens to the distance that they drive or the types of trip that they're on. And that refers back to what I was saying earlier in terms of habituated behavior. You've got a routine. For those of you who are interested in changing that kind of stuff, there's a fellow called Bas Verplanken at University of Bath, and they use it a lot with health research, and it's fantastic. So we've got some stuff on the charging behavior right here. And I'm just going to go back to that earlier one that I showed you. This shows really that the car is fully compatible with that, not fully compatible, is largely compatible with their life. It just slots in so they drive it as they normally drive it. There are some people who would deliberately attempt to exhaust the range, and I've implied that there's an advantage to that. There's probably fewer of them actually than are self-reporting. When we look at the stats, and actually this one's published by now, it's only 1.5% of the trips that go below a 20% state of charge, and only 20% of trips go below 50% of charge. And you think about the demands on the manufacturer. If a potential consumer is saying, I need far more of this thing, and the manufacturer knows, well, you're not using nearly enough of what we've already given you, that's a real balancing act for them in terms of costs. What we did find is that some drivers did deliberately try and challenge the limits of that range. And what we found was that this led to a more sophisticated engagement with the vehicle, because each of the individual components was no longer an individual component. If you are operating at the lowest state of charge, you need to be aware of how the regenerative braking is affecting the journey, how the actual route choice is selecting it, and your driving style. And actually, this means that the driver is more in charge of the driving as well. They feel sort of more intimately connected. This person, I won't read the whole thing out, but is saying that they found that they only had 8% left, and they've been told to equate a percentage to a mile. But they find by doing various things that they can actually get another 20 miles out of the thing. And they feel great about that, of course. So the experience that is one of interconnectivity, and we called that one the secondary adaptation. At this point, I felt that it was only achieved by those people who challenged the range. But actually, so Sarah Mansbridge is doing her PhD on range, and she's just found that there are very few, but there are some who achieve this because for some reason, and we don't quite know, we're going to look back at the data, they are motivated to drive in an energy efficient manner. But largely, it's those people who challenge the range. Sometimes stuff on range tends to look very much at the individual. Is it something about their disposition and their personality characteristics? Is this particular person more likely and comfortable to engage in risk? But it's not simply about that disposition, because we found that some people inadvertently got themselves in a position where they looked like they were going to run out of range. They got very nervous about it, but they made it back. And in making it back, it completely changes the way that they approach it and their understanding of the vehicle. It doesn't mean that they then subsequently go out on lots of long trips. But I did say to Chris and Steve, we think we've got these two different types of driver. Can you send us through the mileage stats just so we can check this? Because there should be objective differences given what we think and feel about their psychology, as it were. And sure enough, the secondary adapters tend to go further on their longest trip. And I should say that for a lot of these people, this is the BMW data. Most of what I've shown you is across the whole UK, but we've got more sophisticated data for them. Most of those long trips were on the very first day taking that car from the Mini plant back to their home for these in the primary lot. So that's even artificially inflated. It could also be that there aren't differences in distance between charges, but there are, and also in terms of the number of trips taken for the longest charge between charges. And their satisfaction with the range differs. So those people who are going into the lower states of charge are more satisfied with the range. Those people who don't are less satisfied with the range. Almost there. So as we approach the end, at the end of the trial, what we found, again, people have talked about price being an important aspect, was that the emphasis tended to go among this group, but again, I say that there are people who are early adopters. The residual price tended to be something that was going to be important, and then they were putting their mind on the maintenance and the support that they would get, given, again, that this is a different type of technology. We know that the secondary adapters have a higher level of expertise, and I'd say that if people are focused on that compatibility and driving it like a normal car, they'll never reach this. So I'd almost counterintuitively, I know that with the test drives, what people do is that they tend to take the driver on a pretty short route. What I'd suggest is that you don't. You have, at least initially, until you create this perspective that the cars can go further than you think. Say your car can go 100 miles, get the experienced driver who's introducing them to the vehicle to drive them 50 miles out, and then say, right, drive it back. And that, so the self-efficacy being sort of major mediator of human behavior, your belief in your ability to do something, on that one trip you will enhance self-efficacy, and they will understand how all of these things work. On the subjective side of things, I'm sure I've missed some stuff out here. However, there's Naomi King is doing stuff on identity and the broader meanings of these vehicles. So the degree to which you feel that whatever it is you do or you buy matches your self-image can have some impact. And also the degree to which what you do or buy you feel enhances your self-image will have a positive or a negative impact too. Just point out that feeling green was not a great thing. It was 3 times as many of the drivers felt that being part of a technology vanguard was the most important thing for them, and 4 times as many in terms of enhancing their self-image. And what we found a lot of was that green came with a lot of baggage, actually. It's ambivalent and ambiguous. So some of the drivers would say to themselves, well, it's not green. It's not like it's a garden that I'm planting or something that's enriching the environment. It is clean. And this aspect of cleanliness and clean tended to be something that people really responded very positively to. And they said, compared to the internal combustion engine car, this is a clean bit of technology. It's cleaner than going to the gas station and filling up. And some of the stuff that Peter was saying too about the convenience of things. Interestingly, in terms of wider meanings, I was tempted to do it, but I thought I'm falling into the same trap. So one of the newspapers had something that was very positive towards electric vehicles and the green agenda, if you like. And within that article, there were several iterations and articulations of people who adopt green technology being slightly mad, radical, swivel-eyed, lefty, loon, hemp-chewing, etc. People who wear Tibetan hats that should only be seen on Tibetans. In a positive article. So even if you are promoting this stuff, you can unwittingly reinforce the kind of negative subjective attributes around these things too. Is it viable in daily life? That's one of the key questions, I guess, that we were asked at the very beginning of the trial. Well, the answer is yes, but there is a strong pull towards normality. And we need to understand that there's a normality that's been established in terms of the range of a vehicle. It doesn't matter if we don't drive it that far. and with the entrenched behavior of the individual. People just don't change unless there's a good reason to change. In terms of the suboptimal usage, there are many different inputs into the driver that encourage that cautious behavior. And the real massive challenge is for those who are selling these is how to convert across that chasm, I think, from the early adopter to the early majority.
Thank you very much.